If Someday Comes. Written by David Calloway. Narrated by Malcolm Griot. Before the Civil War. 1. Even at 12 years old, George knew Ma had waited for their owner, Master Tom Calloway, to walk out of the back door of the big house. It was then that she started to scrub George's ripped and bloody clothes. Master Tom had grabbed the shirt and marched down to the overseer's house, yelled at Bryant up and down, and stomped away red-faced. Bryant got meaner, the work hours got longer, but no one got whipped again. That had been nearly 16 years past. The scars were with George still. After Bryant had died of consumption in 1847, 6 years after the whipping, Master Tom had made George the farm manager until he could find a new, white overseer. Then, 18, George had run the farm well. So well, he had run it since. George worked hard. He was proud of the straight rows, taut fences, that the farm had produced more per acre with him as boss than under old Bryant. On most Sundays, the country's farmers would drive by their neighbors' fields on the way to and from church, checking to see how straight the rows were, if the weeds were chopped, the fences upright and tight. Master Tom was said to have among the neatest of the farms in Bradley County. George ran a farm as well as any man. George didn't know when he started loving Elizabeth. One day in church, he was staring at her, and it just came on him. From that day, he couldn't help himself. And he sure didn't know what to say to her. Ma told him to just walk up and talk to the girl.
You's knowed her for 10 years. She growed up, but she's still the same as she was. People don't change, George.
George didn't believe a word of it. She didn't look or act the same. Elizabeth was strong and slender, smiled politely, and kept her hands still in her lap. Not the Tom girl he'd played with. No more running, rock throwing, or silly things. Not silly at all. Like most things to do with the heart, the women took charge. That next Sunday out in the churchyard, with the entire congregation watching, at least it seemed that way to George, Elizabeth left her mother's side, walked right up to George, and asked him if he knew how old she was. 16-year-old.
You know that's marrying age.
George nodded. And then some. It hadn't been a hot day until that moment. George could barely breathe. His face felt warm, his hands moist. George's mind went blank. Elizabeth's mother, Caroline, and Ma, who had been chatting at a distance, turned and looked at them. Elizabeth stood and looked him straight in the eye, held her ground. I'm wondering. George was wondering what to say next.
Yes, I will,
she said. What? He said.
Marry you.
She smiled. George's knees nearly betrayed him. He put a steadying hand on the tree next to him. Over her shoulder, he could see 2 women watching.
You're gonna have to kiss me sooner or later, George. Might as well be now.
George hugged her, lifted her off the ground, kissed her. He could see his mother's smile. Her father appeared from the other side of the tree. He'd been watching too.
That'll do, George,
Nat continued as George put her down.
You're gonna have a scripture wedding in this here church. And get permission to Master Tom, you know.
He did know. Everything George did was with the permission of, knowledge of, or orders of Master Tom. His life was no different than any slave. George took the earliest opportunity to speak to Master Tom about Elizabeth. It was that next Friday, a clear spring day. Master Tom had been riding his new horse, a beautiful light chestnut Arabian named Johnny after Master Tom's Cherokee friend, Chief John Ross. They were alone in the barnyard. Master Tom dismounted and handed the reins to George.
George?
He nodded, turning away.
Master Tom, sir.
Master Tom turned back and stopped. hearing the formality in George's voice. George stood as full up as he could and took a deep breath.
I have to ask you if I can marry.
Massa Tom smiled, waiting. Finally, he said,
To whom?
Elizabeth?
Grant's Elizabeth.
It was less a question than a statement of fact.
She's the one.
Massa Tom nodded, studied George for a moment.
How old are you now?
26.
Massa Tom nodded again.
Congratulations, George. She's a good choice. I'll speak to Captain Grant.
George woke with a start. The service was over, people were leaving, sunshine was breaking through. As he rushed outside to get the buggy, he saw Massa Tom and Captain Grant talking quietly. George eased up on the far side and listened.
She's worth way more than that, Tom. Young, healthy, well-mannered, a trained housekeeper. She'd fetch $750 on the market.
Captain Grant was standing with his hands in his pocket, relaxed but serious.
And she's real special to me.
Massa Tom narrowed his eyes in concentration, the same way George did.
And George is the same special to me.
Both men nodded in agreement.
I'd never sell either of them.
Grant lowered his eyes, kicked at the dirt once, looked up.
Okay then, I want that Arabian gelding horse that John Ross gave you, even trade.
John is my best horse.
Elizabeth's my best darky.
George felt his stomach flip with nerves. He backed up a few steps, then approached the buggy noisily. He turned the corner just in time to see the two men shaking hands. He would have a wife. I hope you enjoyed this audition. My name is Malcolm Griot.